I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jessie Nippert. Um, Dr. Nippert is University Distinguished Professor at Kansas State University and works at the Konza Prairie Biological Station near Manhattan, Kansas. Today, he's going to be sharing with us about the ecohydrological consequences of woody plant encroachment in tallgrass prairie. And I'm sure many of us who work in grasslands think a lot about woody plant encroachment. So welcome, Jessie. We're happy you're here.
Great. Thanks for having me. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. As Elizabeth noted, I'm at the Konza Prairie LTER site, and we're the one in eastern Kansas that sort of represents the wetter end of this like Great Plains grassland gradient. Maui and Nick's talks did a fantastic job of like sort of setting up like the most pervasive threat to grasslands, that being like conversion to agriculture. And as Nick just pointed out, in some cases, low yielding row crop agriculture. My talk today, I'm going to focus on something that we've been working on for a while now at Konza Prairie, that is the second largest threats to grasslands worldwide after agriculture. And that's woody encroachment, or this like conversion where the grassy system is replaced by typically native woody or shrubby plants that exist therein. Woody encroachment is not a Great Plains problem or a North American problem. This is a threat to grasslands worldwide. Every grassy ecosystem on our planet has the potential for this conversion to woody encroachment, and a lot of them are. And so in my talk today, I'm going to focus a little bit on the mechanisms that are responsible for this, with a particular view on roots, and understanding rooting dynamics is sort of a key feature in this sort of process. It might go a bunch. So woody encroachment, when you think about woody encroachment, there's a lot of potential impacts of this phenomenon. And so as these woody plants come in, you can see reductions in species diversity in a variety of forms. It alters fire intensity on the Konza Prairie. We're a mosaic of fire frequency and grazing, presence or absence of grazers. And so it changes those dynamics. There's also biogeochemical and hydrological changes. And then when you think about the many services that grasslands provide, there's an alteration in those services too. So woody encroachment has sort of a variety of impacts on the overall system. One of the things that we've been spending some time thinking about are the hydrological consequences. One of the benefits of long-term ecological research, its benefits to us as well as broader society, is the long-term data records that include a lot of like climate records. And so one of the things that we've been seeing is that our grassland, like many others, has been drying. And these changes in drying aren't explained by just changes in rainfall. So in the panel on the right, on the top, one of the things that you can see is that we've actually been getting more rainfall over the last few decades. There's been an increasing trend in the amount of rainfall per day when you think about it as a running mean. Over that same time period, we've been seeing a drying of the streams that exist on site. And this doesn't really make sense at first thought. How can you be getting more rainfall while you're seeing like a decrease in like stream flow over time that's fairly significant? Until you start to like think about what's happening on the broader landscape. So we've done some ecohydrological work to try and understand what are the water consequences for this region as woody plants replace grassy. Remember, it's not woody plants just filling in bare ground. It's one life form replacing another. And we've been able to actually scale up some of this work. And over the last 4 decades, we've seen a grass cover decline in areas that are infrequently burned, so a 4-year fire frequency or greater. And they've been replaced by those woody shrubs. Those woody shrubs use more water, like a lot more water. It was a result of roughly a 25% increase in that landscape evapotranspiration. And the evaporation component is low. It's mostly transpiration. So when you think about those changes in stream flow and this acceleration of the hydrological cycle, you can see the consequences very starkly as these woody plants replace the grassy ones. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is trying to understand what is it about rooting dynamics and what is it about the rooting dynamics of these woody plants as they replace grassy ones that might be resulting in these consequences. We've been kind of thinking about roots for like a long period of time, and that's because, as you are all aware, in a grassland ecosystems, that sort of hidden half lies below ground, and it isn't often studied very deeply. And a lot of our assumptions about below ground processes and rooting dynamics basically aren't tested. And sort of like word of mouth, we're like continuing to propagate things that maybe 50, 60, 100 years ago, people made and speculated about the significance that haven't really been adequately tested. So some of the things we've been trying to do is try and start linking how does this structure below ground relate to these functional attributes that are happening on a more broader landscape scale. And then within the Konza Prairie, we're very fortunate that based on this burning mosaic and grazing mosaic that exists across our experimental landscape, we can start to think about how these both top-down and bottom-up drivers over long periods of time influence some of these grassland dynamics and either accelerate woody encroachment or have the potential, like as management prescriptions, that we can start to like translate to larger landscape scales as a mechanism for either like slowing the spread of woody plants or ceasing them altogether. So thinking about some of these like dogmas about roots that have persisted for long periods of time, I basically created my entire professional career trying to like spread the gospel that the old adage that deep roots in prairie plants play some very significant role in like drought conservation. We know this to not be true based on the grasses. Grasses can, of course, be very deeply rooted, but grasses are functionally reliant on water in that top 30 centimeters of the soil, and it doesn't really change based on whether it's a wet year or a dry year. So there's so many things that we can be measuring associated with root systems beyond just how deeply rooted a given species or a given population in a location is. There's so much more that we can start to assess to gain some greater insight into overall ecosystem dynamics. So the questions that I have for you today is I want to talk a little bit about what some of these traits associated with root abundance by depth, how this varies amongst grassy and woody plants. And then I want to talk a little bit more about that teaser that I had in the introduction about these stark ecohydrological consequences. And I want to go into a little bit about what the potential mechanisms are that are driving this. So the first one, in terms of like thinking about differences amongst grassy and woody species, whenever you do below ground research, it's tedious. Like trying to get undergraduates excited to go pick roots for like 3 months in your laboratory is never an easy task. Like it's way more fun to go catch birds or mice or, things like that. When you say, here's a ridiculous amount of roots that we need to pick through, and we got to get it done before they rot, you can watch their like eyes roll back into the back of their head. But this is the most exciting part of a grassland ecosystem, and it's so tremendously understudied. So we go out and we like take these deep cores, we pick the roots out, we scan them, and we get the biomass. And you can start to see how differences in fire and grazing are impacting processes across the landscape. So here I have a panel where I have areas collected, different fire frequencies at Konza, 1 year, 4 year, and 20 year, in patches that were exclusively grassy or woody. And you can start to see how fine root distributions vary all the way down to a meter deep. Typically, a lot of these investigations stop in that first, roughly 20 or 30 centimeters. But you go deeper and you can start to see a little bit more clearly what's happening. As not surprisingly, in areas that are annually burned, they have greater root biomass in those most superficial soil layers. One of the things that was surprising to us is that the fine roots in the woody patches was a lot higher than we expected. When you start to look at other aspects of this ecosystem that include both root length and then the development of specific root length, higher specific root length is more indicative of acquisitive roots, like roots that are playing more of a functional role potentially in uptake. You can start to see a little bit more stark differences between these areas that have grassy versus woody roots when you start taking this into consideration. One of the things that we were excited to do is get more of an estimate on, instead of just standing biomass, but starting to think about below ground net primary productivity. So this is what is that root turnover per year? This was difficult to do. It was difficult to do to a meter deep, but we have data that I'm showing here from both 2020 and 2021 for both areas that were both burned every year and every 4 years, and then either a completely grassy or woody component. Again, the areas that are burned every year are producing more roots. This is significant because when you think about burning, some of the times you think about from a carbon cycle perspective, you're volatilizing that biomass. Maybe you're accelerating CO2 losses to the atmosphere. But in a grassland ecosystem, especially one that's productive, like in the tallgrass prairie, you're actually locking more carbon below ground in the area where it tends to be a little bit more resilient long term. And you're doing that because the fire stimulates root production below ground. So you can see that very clearly in these grassy areas. One of the things that we found is in our location in 2021, it was a pretty dry year. And you can really see in that top right panel, the increase in grass biomass, grass below ground productivity in 2021 compared to the 1 year compared to the 4 year. But one of the things we were surprised by was just how much how much fine root biomass was actually being produced by our encroaching woody plants in the Konza Prairie. This, though, was just fine root biomass. Getting a look at coarse root biomass is a little bit more difficult because those root distributions aren't often, a small root core won't actually quantify those. So to do this, we undertook an excavation project where we started excavating entire woody shrub clonal islands. In doing so, we've been able to use 3D scanners to create models of that intact below ground woody root architecture. This is providing greater insight into that distribution of those coarse woody roots as they're distributed across greater depths in the soil. So now we can start to put together a picture for the woody plants, how they're distributing both their fine and woody roots as you sort of move through the soil profile in areas that have different land management frequencies. So we're starting to have a much better handle on the carbon cycle implications, basically, of woody encroachment and how it's impacted by fire frequencies. The other thing, though, that I wanted to come back to was, again, this hydrological cycle component. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that as these woody plants replace the grassy ones, there's on average across a landscape up to a 25% increase per year in terms of the water that's being lost to the atmosphere. That's a ridiculously high number for thinking about an acceleration of the hydrological cycle. So one of the things that we wanted to do was model it. Where is this water coming from that's being lost? So working with hydrologists, we've been using hydrological models to sort of partition the different components of the landscape that are potentially influencing stream and broader landscape dynamics. You can think about water moving across the surface, water moving through that vadose upper soil zone, or deep water that is associated with groundwater in the lower zone, and how these all contribute to stream dynamics and distributions across the landscape. So when you create flow fractions, one of the things that you will notice is that both runoff and the contributions from soil water have been decreasing through time in terms of making their way actually to the stream, such that right now, our stream water is over 80% groundwater, and our groundwater levels have actually been declining through time. So based on this, it's not surprising that our streams are drying because the sources that are contributing them are changing. So why are they changing? How is this happening? We've been using some novel hydrological techniques to start to get at understanding changes in soil drying through time. So using electrical resistivity tomography, you can go out and literally map changes in drying trends across the landscape in the top few meters of that soil surface. And this pattern that on this figure, this darker red area indicates greater soil drying. And you can see with the cartoon above, this sort of illustrating the changes in vegetative communities. Under these shrubs, they are drying the soils to much deeper soil depths than would have happened in the past. So you can imagine, and we have long-term data associated with long-term soil moisture collection at our LTER site that backs up this sort of mapping procedure. And so in such a way, you can imagine that potentially lateral water movements through portions of the soil profile getting into those stream networks you can see why they're declining and why this portion of the potential sources for stream flow have been impacted so drastically. Then the last thing that I wanted to show you is that thinking about these changes in rooting patterns. So here's two different diagrams across the Konza Prairie sort of landscape, where you can think about a grassy system on the left with their superficial roots that are, for the most part, fine roots. And then you can see what happens when, in the cartoon on the right, when the woody shrubs sort of replace them. We were talking about that large investment in coarse woody roots. When this happens, we're starting to collect data, and what we surmise is those coarse woody roots are creating what you would call a soil macropore. And those soil macropores provide preferential flow pathways for water to actually penetrate deeper into the system and bypass the normal lateral movements that would be responsible for like recharge dynamics in the system. So in such a way, you're speeding up rates of infiltration to the groundwater, you're speeding up overall potential pathways, you're carrying more CO2 to depth. That CO2 then becomes carbonic acid and accelerates the weathering of the bedrock. And it results in this overall gross acceleration of the cycle and potential long-term drying trends. This is significant because from a conservation perspective, you can go in and cut those woody plants down, but those roots remain. Those pathways in the soil have been created, and this will take potentially centuries for those soil dynamics to be altered. So even when you go in and you remove those woody plants, the damage has already been done. So that gets at how very, very significant these woody plants are to alterations in the hydrological cycle. So with the data that I've shown you today, you can think about how changes in root distribution, density, and morphology vary as a function of fire frequency, and how they vary amongst woody and grassy species. This has distinct implications for the carbon cycle. And then I provided a lot of information that illustrates that when these woody roots replace grassy roots, there's this large change in ET and the potential for long-term consequences that can impact the dynamics of water flux. None of us work in a vacuum. I have been working with some amazing colleagues that are everything from engineers and modelers to hydrologists. And I'm happy to have been invited to talk a little bit about some of our research here today with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jesse. That was fascinating. We've got time for questions, and I'm going to kick it off with one that's in the Q&A. But if anyone has a question, please feel free to turn your video on, and I'll call on you, and we'll ask those questions by video. So the first question here is from Phoebe. What are the main woody species encroaching upon the tallgrass prairies where you work?
Sure. So we, like a lot of folks, we have problems with juniper, but juniper for us is an easier one to control because with fire, you can get juniper under control pretty quickly. For us, it's clonal shrub species, where the primary ones are roughleaf dogwood and then sumac, so smooth sumac. So there are a few other ones. We have a rose and a prunus and a few others. But for us, it's primarily these clonal woody plants that are the most difficult for us to control.
Great. There's a question in the chat from Suzanne. I'm going to just ask Suzanne, would you like to come on video and ask this directly, or would you prefer I read it?
I'm trying to come on video. Okay, I think I'm
there
on.
We go. We gotcha. We gotcha.
I was just wondering if you did any studies of the interception of rainfall by the foliage before it even reaches the ground, and if that plays a role, or if the rainfall that's intercepted by the graminoid foliage is comparable.
Yeah, so we have done that, and you can kind of make some estimates based on changes in like leaf area density of the canopies. The woody plants do have a higher leaf area density, but a lot of times as they intercept moisture, it flows to the stem, and because they're a multi-stem species, it then flows to the surface. So if a rain event is small, say 5 millimeters or less, for a lot in both the grassy and shrubby areas, it doesn't tend to wet the soil surface. But in rain events greater than 5 millimeters or so, you start to see significant, wetting events. So canopy interception, there's probably some small differences. The woody plants would be a little bit higher, but not by a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Great. If anyone else, there's time. If anyone else has a question, there is a comment I'll just uplift in the chat from Sunny from Tennessee Natural Heritage, talking about this is an idea that they had discussed and several years ago, and really appreciated seeing this data and new perspective on this important topic. All right, I'll give us just a few more seconds. If I see someone come off a video, we'll ask that question. If not, we're going to start transitioning to our fourth speaker for the afternoon.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, you know, yeah, really interesting talk. Thinking about woody removal. You mentioned, you know, when you cut down the woody removals, you're removing that above ground biomass, but that root system is still there and the pathways are still there. Do you have any, I don't know, insight, comments into, like, from a management perspective, you know, how do we use this research to sort of is it just pushing the timeline, try to catch things before they get too bad, or what do you do about those systems once they're there, once they're established?
So often, we're so reactive as ecologists, like we see something happen. And in this case, like with woody encroachment and these clonal plants, we have to be more prescriptive. You have to keep them out before they get in. One of the benefits of an LTER site is so Konza Prairie is now in its 43rd year of like being in the LTER. We have over 43 years of long-term data that are available online. The other amazing thing is people set up experiments that run for decades. So it doesn't just end when someone's career ends, then the next generation of people benefit and can maintain. One of the things that happened on Konza Prairie is after 20 years of fire being managed in the same way, in the year 2000, they flipped it. So areas that were infrequently burned were now burned every year, and then vice versa. And in the areas that had been infrequently burned, they had filled with woody plants between 1980 and 2000. We've now burned that area every single year for the last 23 years. Those clonal shrubs are still there. They are sitting there at knee height, waiting for a break, basically, in this fire regime, and then they can go back to their former glory. So there's a huge hysteresis effect that exists in this system, and it is going to take novel solutions, probably interacting drivers, to try and get rid of these things. It is very difficult to kill them. We've had some evidence that shows that how we can get to that point, but we need a lot more research on this topic. But we do know fire by itself is not going to work, and our preliminary evidence suggests that drought is not going to work. So
yeah.
So sorry to be such a downer, but like, we're still like working on it.
Yeah,
Great.
no, that's great.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure we'll have more to talk about on this, but thank you, Dr. Nippert.